in '68, I was called down for my first draft physical. So I was in the process of being drafted, but I wound up going into the Army, and I joined the Army in order to avoid being drafted. So I graduated from college in June of '69 with a bachelor's degree in business administration. And my first day in the Army was September 6th of 1969.
You're about to be inducted into the Armed Forces of the United States. You will take one step forward as your name is called.
I was one of the very fortunate ones, and I say that laughingly, to be selected to go to Fort Polk, Louisiana, which at the time had the reputation of being the toughest Army post. It was called Little Vietnam. We had an area on the post that was called Tigerland. It was set up just like villages and the Fermatera of Vietnam, where we trained. I was selected to go to infantry, the advanced infantry school at the North Fort. We were 3/4 of the way through. They called us out. Now we were into 1970, early 1970. They said that President Nixon at the time had decided that he was going to stop the flow of combat troops to Vietnam. He initiated something called Vietnamization, where we were turning things over, the control of the war and the responsibility for the fighting, to the Vietnamese. But they took a bunch of us. We found out later they looked at our what they call general aptitude test scores, and they selected us to get cross-trained in another MOS, military occupational specialty. And then I, along with several of the other guys, were sent to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, to become a combat medic. Well, a combat medic isn't much more than an infantryman, only he carries an extra bag with all of his medical equipment. I was quickly asked by the sergeant major of our company if I would be interested in going to the non-commissioned officer academy. I did graduate in the top third. The top third of the class were automatically promoted to E5. The Army referred to us as shake and bake. If you remember the old recipe where you could shake and bake a piece of chicken, let's say, you coat it with whatever, then you cook it quickly, and it comes out pretty well. Well, that's what they called us, shake and bakes. I went from an E5 sergeant to an O1 lieutenant, second lieutenant. As we got into the late 70s, the military was doing their reduction in force. We called it the RIF, R-I-F, reduction in force. They were eliminating a lot of positions. They were sending a lot of people. A lot of the officers like myself who had a reserve commission were being told, go find a reserve position. We got to reduce the force. I was never told that, but I could see the writing on the wall. So I found a reserve military unit back in Connecticut, which is where I was from, in New Haven. It was a battalion-sized unit, 616 people in the unit. It was a medical unit, so it was right up my alley. And in 1984, as a brand new major, I was given the opportunity to go down to Central America to a place called Sotocano, base Sotocano, not too far from Tegucigalpa in Honduras. And our whole purpose there was to win the hearts and minds of the local people, keep them on the side of the Americans. And I was put in charge as a company commander of a whole group of medics who we farmed out with the different patrols that were going to the different villages. When our guys got there, they'd spend a day or two. All the people would line up. They'd give them inoculations. They'd pull teeth if their teeth were bad. Now, in the background, what was going on was the Nicaraguans, Sandinistas, and the Contras were fighting. And some of our military people, some of our infantry people were keeping a very close eye on that. We had actually the 101st Airborne guys with us as our guards. But in late November of 1990, I received a fax that came across to my civilian office, because I was working as a civilian as well. I was selected as an individual to be sent immediately up to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, to go with a unit, a headquarters unit that was being sent to Desert Shield over in Saudi Arabia. It was a 53-person medical headquarters brigade, and I was being given the S4 position, or the logistics officer position, over the supply and maintenance. I knew it could always happen. I knew that the contract that I had with the Army was subject to being recalled at any moment.
At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia.
When I saw Desert Shield starting to happen, and then I saw some of the Army Reserve and National Guard units being called up, I thought, this could happen. But I thought that I would be called up with a unit. I wasn't. I was pulled out as an individual and sent with a whole brand new unit. The 803rd is what they were called. We arrived in Saudi Arabia like about a week before Christmas. Terrible conditions. Everybody thought we were going to be hot and sweaty. We were freezing. It was cold, the coldest winter Saudi Arabia had had in many, many years. And we were given a spot to set up a camp. Well, we set up one tent the very first night very quickly so that the 9 of us could get out of the blowing sand and the cold. The next morning, there was a Saudi Arabian military officer. I don't know what rank. I couldn't tell what rank he had. But he was yelling and screaming at me because supposedly we were on sacred ground. So we moved. We moved to where he told us we were supposed to be. There was really nothing around. So we moved and we started setting up our camp. Our headquarters unit only had 9 tents. We set up the 9 tents. We got everything prepared. We were communicating through the military city back with our people back in Dhahran who arrived up on, I believe it was New Year's Eve or New Year's Day that they arrived up there. They weren't very happy with what they saw. They saw 9 tents set up in the desert. We had very little concertina wire or anything for protection. The ground was so hard you could not dig foxholes or trenches. But we were there. And around us, the military built our entire brigade. We eventually were the headquarters for 2,500 people. We were there eventually to give medical support, medical evacuation support primarily to the 1st Cavalry Division. However, General Schwarzkopf, who everyone knew from Desert Storm, came in and changed the plan. He took the 1st Cavalry Division, this would have been in early January of '91, and sent them way far off towards Jordan, way to the west. He moved in the 3rd Armored Division from Germany. They were stationed in Germany. Day after day after day, we saw tanks, we saw fighting vehicles, we saw trucks rolling by us up to the line, getting in position up there. It was security for sure to see them, but we knew that something was up, that we were going to have a real showdown here in the desert. We were under the impression that the entire war, ground war and air war, was going to start by about the 15th of January, because that was the date that was given to the Iraqis to get out of Kuwait. Nothing happened until the 17th. On the 17th of January, 1991, the air war started. But the ground troops were told, stand fast and wait, which was really a very good strategy because the Air Force, our Air Force, was very, very good. They went up ahead of us, probably 10 miles ahead of us. There were berms built, these big trenches with protective bunkers and everything else that the Iraqis had built. And our Air Force attacked all these lines of defense and really made life miserable for the Iraqis, killed a lot of them, quite frankly, softened them up for sure. So the ground war didn't start for a month later. And when finally the ground war started, the day before the ground war started, a bunch of us officers from the brigade went up in a vehicle to visit the troops up there, the 3rd Armored Division troops who were sitting on their vehicles. They had all their preparations made. They were ready to go. We were walking around wishing them well. I remember saying to one young troop, what if they use chemicals? He looked at me and he said, sir, he says, we don't sweat the small stuff, he said. There was one major road out of Kuwait that ran all the way to Baghdad, which eventually was called the Road of Death. Because the timing with the 3rd Armored Division, with their helicopters and their tanks and their fighting vehicles, was such that they caught the Iraqis, something like 3,300 of them, hightailing it out of Kuwait. Now, myself and our troops, we were one day behind the warriors. So all we saw, we heard a lot of stuff, but all we saw was the results a day later. And it was devastating, absolutely devastating. I personally rode through the Valley of Death with a bunch of other soldiers, and we saw the destruction. Eventually, our headquarters unit wound up in a place called Safawan, Iraq, which was not too far from Basra. Now, a couple of days later, this got into March, I was sent down on helicopter with 2 other guys. We were going to establish a coordination with a unit down there so we could put one of our battalions down there to help support bringing evacuations, military and civilian medical evacuations, back to our hospitals on the Saudi border. We flew down. The day we flew down, it was terrible. Everything was covered with oil. You could taste the oil. It was on your skin because the oil wells were burning. And as we got closer to Kuwait City, there they were, all burning. It was really a miserable time. Just as we were landing, and we were in a medevac, UE medevac, a pilot turned around and looked at me and said, "When I touch the ground, you guys get off. We'll be back. We got to go pick up a Marine that got hurt." So I said, "Okay, fine, we'll stay here," because the pilot knew where we were going, who we were going to coordinate with. We got off. I immediately laid down. I hadn't slept much in about 3 days. And a few minutes later, I heard helicopters coming and going and planes coming and going at Kuwait Airfield, which was all on fire. And the corporal, young corporal, says to me, "Sir," he says, "wake up." I said, "What's up?" He said, "The general's here." I said, "Which general?" He said, "The general." And now he meant Norman Schwarzkopf. By the time I got up, put my rifle on my shoulder, because you went nowhere without it, the corporal was over there shaking the hand of General Schwarzkopf. I said, "If he can do it, I can do it." I walked over. We all had a camera in one of our ammo pouches, took the camera out, and I've got a wonderful picture of myself and General Norman Schwarzkopf. And by the end of March, all of our troops were back on the Saudi border at our base. Other units around us were packing up, getting ready to go home. We were told to stand fast. And we were then assigned as the support brigade for the 800th MP Battalion, which was setting up 2 large POW camps. They had captured thousands and thousands of POWs. The camps were pretty demanding on us. Our people were up there. I went up there about every other day to check on things. And something that made my troops mad was they separated their own people. The officers would not exist with the enlisted people. The NCOs would not exist with the enlisted people. The Muslims would not exist with any of the non-Muslims. They were very, very anti each other, depending upon what tribe they came with, what religion they professed, and whatnot. It was miserable. Luckily enough, at the end of May of 1991, they did send us orders to go home. We went home. And so I'm very thankful. I wound up spending 27 years. I do get a pension from the military. And we came down to Florida. VERO has a very, very active Veterans Council. I got involved with it, along with the Military Officers Association. I think it's extremely important that the veterans know that there are people here willing to help them. Our whole mission is veterans helping veterans, and we do an awful lot for that. Not only do we help pay rent when they're in trouble or bail them out of some situation that they're having, they feel that even though some of us are old, others are young, we're all part of it, and we've served our country, and we eventually, this younger crew, which we call the next gen, will take over our jobs and keep supporting each other. So it's rewarding. I'm glad to be taking part of it, and I'm glad to be a veteran. We're giving back.